They told Sergeant Alexis Ramone she was too gentle to handle lethal force training. 2 days later, when 3 Marine recruits aimed their weapons directly at her head during what they thought was a standard drill, what she did in the next 12 seconds didn't just disarm them, it made everyone in that Nevada training compound realize they were staring at someone who had been professionally trained to end lives with her bare hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Thornfield, a sprawling military training facility carved into the high desert 30 miles outside of Reno. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the concrete, and the distant mountains looked like jagged teeth against the cloudless sky. It was the kind of place where assumptions got tested, where young soldiers learned the difference between playing war and preparing for it. But on this particular Tuesday in September, nobody expected the most dangerous person on the entire base to be the quiet woman in civilian clothes standing near the equipment shed. Alexis Ramone looked like someone's older sister who'd stopped by to watch a little brother's soccer game. She was 31 years old, 5'6", with shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light when she turned her head. Her clothes were unremarkable khaki pants, a simple blue polo shirt, and worn hiking boots that had seen better days. She wore no makeup, no jewelry except for a plain silver watch, and carried herself with the kind of easy confidence that didn't demand attention. Most people who glanced her way saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a contractor, maybe a medic or an administrative specialist, someone whose job involved clipboards and safety briefings rather than anything that mattered when bullets started flying. They couldn't have been more wrong. The 3 Marine recruits who would soon learn this lesson the hard way were huddled together near the obstacle course, checking their gear with the nervous energy of young men trying to prove they belonged. Private Danny Kowalski was 19 and built like a linebacker, all shoulders and swagger. He'd grown up in Detroit, telling anyone who'd listen that he was going to be force recon, that he was harder than anyone else in his recruiting class. Private Miguel Santos was smaller but wiry, a kid from Phoenix who joined the Marines to escape a neighborhood where the wrong turn could get you killed. He moved with the quick, alert energy of someone who'd learned to watch corners. The 3rd recruit, Private James Fletcher, was the quiet one, tall, methodical, the kind of soldier who followed orders precisely but rarely volunteered for anything extra. All 3 had completed boot camp at Parris Island with solid marks, and they'd been selected for this advanced combat training course because their instructors saw potential. What they didn't see was the woman who'd been watching them for the past hour, cataloging their movements, noting how they handled their weapons, observing the small tells that revealed how they'd react under real pressure. Alexis had been doing this kind of assessment for longer than any of them had been thinking about military service. It was automatic now, the way a mechanic notices the sound of an engine or a doctor reads the signs of illness. She saw Kowalski's overconfidence in the way he shouldered his rifle, Santos's hypervigilance in his constant scanning, Fletcher's hesitation in the split-second delay before he followed commands. All useful information, all patterns that could be exploited. The training exercise was supposed to be routine. Close-quarters combat simulation, weapon retention drills, the kind of controlled scenario designed to stress-test new Marines without actually putting them in danger. The instructors had briefed it as a confidence builder, a chance for the recruits to apply their training in a realistic but safe environment. Staff Sergeant Mike Torino was running the drill, a career Marine with 14 years in the Corps and 2 deployments to Afghanistan. He was good at his job, respected by his peers, and had trained hundreds of recruits without incident. He'd been told that a contractor would be observing today, someone from the Pentagon Special Operations Command who was evaluating training protocols. He'd been told to run the exercise normally and not to worry about the civilian observer. He hadn't been told who the observer really was. The scenario began simply enough. The recruits were tasked with clearing a mock building, a plywood and concrete structure designed to simulate an urban combat environment. Room-to-room movement, proper angles, communication protocols. Basic stuff they'd drilled 100 times. Alexis positioned herself where she could see everything, near enough to evaluate their techniques but far enough to stay out of the way. She made notes on a tablet, looking every bit the part of a bureaucrat, checking boxes for some distant office in Washington. That's when the exercise went sideways, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The instructors had planted role players in the mock building, soldiers acting as enemy combatants who would provide resistance and force the recruits to make split-second decisions. But one of the role players, a young corporal named Davis, who was filling in for someone who'd called in sick, misunderstood his instructions. Instead of waiting in the designated room, he moved to intercept the recruits in the main hallway. Instead of using the training weapons loaded with blanks, he grabbed a rifle that looked identical but wasn't part of the exercise. And instead of following the carefully scripted scenario, he decided to improvise. The recruits rounded the corner and found themselves face to face with what they thought was an enemy fighter. Their training kicked in, but panic kicked in harder. Kowalski raised his weapon and shouted a command. Santos moved to flank but tripped over equipment that hadn't been cleared from the previous exercise. Fletcher froze, his finger on the trigger, unsure whether to fire or wait for orders. The role player, realizing something was wrong but not sure what, raised his own weapon in response. That's when Alexis stopped taking notes. She could see what the recruits couldn't, that this wasn't going according to script, that the safety protocols had broken down, that 3 young Marines were about to make decisions that could haunt them for the rest of their lives. She could also see something else, something that made her blood run cold. The role player's weapon wasn't just pointed in the general direction of the recruits. It was aimed directly at the center of mass of Private Santos, who was still struggling to regain his footing after his fall. The margin for error had just disappeared in 12 seconds. Everyone at Camp Thornfield would learn why Alexis Ramone had spent 8 years with a unit that officially didn't exist, why she'd been trained by instructors whose names were classified, and why the Pentagon had sent her to observe routine training exercise that was about to become anything but routine. The quiet contractor, with the clipboard, was about to remind them all that the most lethal weapons in any arsenal were the ones nobody saw coming. Alexis Ramone arrived at Camp Thornfield every morning at exactly 0700 hours, parking her dusty Honda Civic in the civilian contractor lot between a dented pickup truck and a government sedan that had seen better decades. She carried the same worn leather messenger bag each day, filled with the mundane tools of bureaucratic observation. They told Sergeant Alexis Ramone she was too gentle to handle lethal force training. 2 days later, when 3 Marine recruits aimed their weapons directly at her head during what they thought was a standard drill, what she did in the next 12 seconds didn't just disarm them, it made everyone in that Nevada training compound realize they were staring at someone who had been professionally trained to end lives with her bare hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Thornfield, a sprawling military training facility carved into the high desert 30 miles outside of Reno. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the concrete, and the distant mountains looked like jagged teeth against the cloudless sky. It was the kind of place where assumptions got tested, where young soldiers learned the difference between playing war and preparing for it. But on this particular Tuesday in September, Nobody expected the most dangerous person on the entire base to be the quiet woman in civilian clothes standing near the equipment shed. Alexis Ramone looked like someone's older sister who'd stopped by to watch a little brother's soccer game. She was 31 years old, 5'6", with shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light when she turned her head. Her clothes were unremarkable khaki pants, a simple blue polo shirt, and worn hiking boots that had seen better days. She wore no makeup, no jewelry except for a plain silver watch, and Staff Sergeant Torino had initially been concerned about having a civilian observer shadowing his training exercises. He'd run a tight program for 6 years, and the last thing he needed was some desk jockey from Washington second-guessing his methods or questioning his results. But Alexis had put his concerns to rest within the first week. She stayed out of the way, never interfered with instruction, and showed no signs of the know-it-all attitude that sometimes came with Pentagon oversight. She was, in his words to the other instructors, one of the good ones, a contractor who understood that her job was to observe and document, not to manage or critique. The recruits were even less aware of her significance. To them, she was simply background noise, another adult in civilian clothes, who had some connection to the endless parade of evaluations and assessments that defined military life. A few had tried to make conversation during breaks, asking where she was from or how long she'd be staying at Camp Thornfield. She'd answered their questions pleasantly but briefly, offering just enough personal information to seem human without revealing anything meaningful about her background. She was from back east. She worked for government training programs, and she'd be wrapping up soon. Safe. Boring answers that discouraged follow-up questions. Her appearance supported the illusion perfectly. The auburn hair was styled in a practical cut that required minimal maintenance, professional enough for government work, but unremarkable enough to avoid standing out. Her clothes were selected from the Civilian Contractor Uniform Handbook, business casual attire that projected competence without suggesting any specialized knowledge. The hiking boots were the only hint of something more active in her background. But even those looked like the kind of practical footwear that someone might wear if their job involved walking around military bases and industrial facilities. She carried herself with the posture of someone accustomed to office work, shoulders slightly forward, head tilted down toward her tablet, movements economical but unhurried. When she walked, it was with the measured pace of someone crossing the campus or navigating a conference center, not the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent years moving through hostile territory. Her hands, when not holding her tablet or coffee, hung relaxed at her sides. No hypervigilance, no constant scanning, no subtle positioning that might suggest tactical awareness. The only people who might have recognized something different about Alexis were the career senior NCOs, the master sergeants and first sergeants, who'd spent decades learning to read people in situations. But even they saw what she wanted them to see. She deferred to their expertise, asked permission before entering training areas, and maintained the kind of respectful distance that suggested someone who understood military hierarchy without being part of it. To them, she was a competent civilian doing a necessary but unremarkable job. Her daily interaction with the base personnel followed predictable patterns. She would arrive, check in with whoever was running the training schedule, position herself where she could observe without interfering, and spend the day making notes on training procedures and safety protocols. During lunch breaks, she ate alone, usually reviewing her morning notes or reading what appeared to be policy documents on her tablet. She rarely initiated conversations, but when others approached her, she was friendly and professional, knowledgeable enough about military acronyms and procedures to hold her own in casual conversation, but never so knowledgeable that she seemed like anything other than an experienced contractor. The base commander had met with her briefly during her first week, a courtesy introduction that lasted exactly 15 minutes and covered Nothing more significant than base facilities and security protocols. She'd answered his questions about her evaluation timeline and reporting requirements with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she'd done this type of work many times before. He'd walked away satisfied that the Pentagon had sent someone competent but unremarkable. Exactly the kind of low-profile oversight that wouldn't disrupt his training schedule or create unnecessary complications. What none of them knew was that every casual glance, every seemingly random position choice, every polite question about training procedures was part of a comprehensive assessment that went far beyond anything outlined in her official contractor paperwork. While they saw a bureaucrat taking notes on safety protocols, Alexis was conducting the kind of operational analysis that had once helped plan missions where success was measured in lives saved and enemies eliminated rather than forms completed and boxes checked. But that was a different life, one that officially had never existed. The woman observing training exercises at Camp Thornfield was just another contractor, earning a paycheck while helping the Pentagon understand how well their training programs worked. At least, that's what everyone believed until 3 Marine recruits made the mistake of pointing their weapons at someone who had been trained to kill long before they'd ever thought about joining the military. The quiet contractor was about to become something else entirely. The leather messenger bag that Alexis carried to Camp Thornfield each morning contained more than government forms and evaluation checklists. Hidden beneath the mundane paperwork, in a compartment that looked like standard laptop padding, were discharge papers from a unit that didn't appear on any public organizational charts. The documents were stamped with classifications that most military personnel would never see. And they told the story of 8 years spent in places that officially didn't exist, doing work that was never discussed outside of soundproof briefings. Rooms in unmarked buildings. Staff Sergeant Alexis Ramone had been recruited for the 75th Ranger Regiment's Special Operations Task Force, while still completing her advanced individual training at Fort Benning. Her psychological profile had caught the attention of talent scouts who specialized in identifying soldiers capable of operating in moral gray areas where traditional rules of engagement became suggestions rather than absolutes. She scored in the 99th percentile for stress tolerance, demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills, and most importantly, showed the kind of emotional compartmentalization that allowed someone to make life and death decisions without hesitation or regret. Her official military occupational specialty was listed as 11B Infantry, but that designation served primarily as administrative cover. Her real training took place at facilities that weren't marked on any maps, under instructors whose backgrounds were so classified that they were known only by call signs. She learned urban warfare tactics from former SAS operators, assassination techniques from retired CIA paramilitaries, and psychological operations from instructors who'd spent decades manipulating foreign governments. By the time she completed the program, she could kill silently with improvised weapons, conduct surveillance in hostile territory for weeks without detection, and eliminate high-value targets using methods that left no forensic evidence. Her first deployment was to a region of Southeast Asia that she was never allowed to discuss, even in classified debriefings years later. Her unit operated under commercial cover, posing as employees of a multinational corporation while conducting operations designed to destabilize a government that had become inconvenient to American interests. She spent 6 months in country, during which she was responsible for 3 confirmed eliminations and provided intelligence that led to the successful completion of 17 additional missions. Her after-action reports, when they existed at all, were filed under code names that changed monthly and stored in archives that required presidential authorization to access. The second deployment took her to Eastern Europe, during a period when official American military presence was diplomatically impossible, but unofficial intervention was strategically necessary. Working with a team of operators from multiple agencies, she helped orchestrate the collapse of an arms trafficking network that had been supplying weapons to terrorist organizations throughout the region. Her role involved deep cover infiltration of the criminal organization, a process that required her to convincingly portray a corrupt American military contractor willing to sell classified technology to foreign buyers. Over 8 months, she gathered intelligence that led to the seizure of weapons worth over $200 million and the arrest of 37 individuals across 6 countries. During this deployment, she killed for the first time with her bare hands. A mid-level trafficker had become suspicious of her cover identity and arranged to meet her in a warehouse outside Prague, ostensibly to discuss a large weapons purchase, but actually to interrogate and eliminate her. The man was experienced in violence, 40 pounds heavier than Alexis, and armed with both a pistol and backup support, waiting outside the building. The confrontation lasted less than 2 minutes. She used techniques learned from Krav Maga instructors and refined through countless hours of practice against progressively skilled opponents, disarming him with a joint lock that shattered his wrist, then applying a blood choke that rendered him unconscious before crushing his trachea with a precise strike from her elbow. She was back at her hotel within an hour, attending a diplomatic reception where she spent the evening discussing European art with the Belgian cultural attaché. The third deployment was the one that ended her operational career. Northern Africa, another region she couldn't name even in private conversations with family members who didn't know she'd ever left American soil. Her mission involved eliminating a terrorist cell leader who had been responsible for multiple attacks against civilian targets. The operation required her to pose as a medical volunteer with an international aid organization, using her cover to gain access to the remote compound where her target was. Hiding among refugees fleeing a regional conflict, the mission went perfectly. Until the moment it didn't. Her target was eliminated as planned. A single injection of an untraceable toxin administered during what appeared to be routine medical treatment. But as she prepared to extract from the area, the compound came under attack from a rival terrorist faction. What followed was 18 hours of urban combat, during which her unit had to fight their way through hostile territory while protecting the civilian aid workers, whose covers they had been using. By the time they reached the extraction point, 7 aid workers were dead, 14 were wounded, and Alexis had been forced to kill 12 combatants, using everything from suppressed pistols to improvised explosive devices. The psychological evaluation that followed her return to the United States revealed signs of what the military psychiatrists delicately termed operational fatigue. She was experiencing nightmares, demonstrating hypervigilance in civilian environments, and showing decreased empathy responses during standardized testing. More concerning was her growing reluctance to accept new mission assignments, particularly those involving civilian casualties or collateral damage. After 8 years of flawless service, Staff Sergeant Alexis Ramone was becoming a liability rather than an asset. The discharge was processed quietly, with full honors and a benefits package that ensured her financial security while guaranteeing her silence. Her military records were sanitized to remove any reference to classified operations, leaving behind the administrative skeleton of a conventional infantry career with standard deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. The real story of her service existed only in files stored in facilities that didn't officially exist, accessible only to individuals whose names appeared on lists that were updated monthly and reviewed by cabinet-level officials. For 2 years after leaving the military, Alexis lived in a small apartment outside Tucson, Arizona, collecting disability payments and attempting to readjust to civilian life. She tried college courses, lasted 3 weeks at a security company job, and spent 6 months working at a nonprofit organization that helped veterans transition to civilian careers. Nothing held her interest. The skills that had made her invaluable to her former unit, the ability to read people instantly, to assess threats automatically, to solve problems with controlled violence, had no application in normal life. That's when the Pentagon approached her about contract work, the official job. Description involved evaluating training programs and safety protocols at military installations across the country. The unofficial job description was more complicated. There were growing concerns about the quality of training that new recruits received, particularly in high-stress scenarios that might resemble actual combat. Too many young soldiers were graduating from advanced programs without the kind of instinctive responses that could keep them alive when training became reality. The Pentagon needed someone who could assess not just whether training programs followed proper procedures, but whether they actually prepared soldiers for the psychological pressure of life-and-death situations. Alexis was uniquely qualified for this work. She understood both sides of the equation, what effective training should accomplish and what real combat actually required. More importantly, she could evaluate training scenarios from the perspective of someone who had spent years thinking like an enemy combatant. Someone who knew how to exploit weaknesses and capitalize on hesitation. If there were flaws in current training methods, she would find them. If there were vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit, she would identify them before they became casualties. The work suited her. It kept her connected to the military community without requiring her to kill anyone, provided intellectual challenges without triggering the psychological responses that had ended her operational career, and gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing since her discharge. Over the past year, she had evaluated training programs at 17 different installations, filed reports that had led to significant changes in protocol at 8 facilities, and identified safety concerns that had prevented what could have been serious training accidents. Camp Thornfield was supposed to be routine. Standard infantry training, basic combat scenarios, experienced instructors with solid safety records. Her evaluation was scheduled to last 4 weeks, after which she would file a report confirming that the facility met Pentagon standards and move on to her next assignment. She had been observing exercises for 3 weeks without noting any significant concerns. That was about to change. In less than 30 seconds, the quiet contractor taking notes on training procedures was going to remember why she had once been considered one of the most dangerous people in the American military. The skills that would save lives at Camp Thornfield had their roots in a childhood spent on a cattle ranch outside Billings, Montana, where Alexis learned that hesitation could mean the difference between controlling a dangerous situation and becoming its victim. Her father, Robert Ramone, was a third-generation rancher who had spent 4 years as a Marine Corps Scout sniper in Vietnam before returning home to work the land his grandfather had purchased with money earned laying railroad track in the 1920s. He never talked about his military service, but the lessons he'd learned about reading terrain, assessing threats, and maintaining calm under pressure became part of how he raised his only daughter. The Ramone Ranch sprawled across 8,000 acres of rolling grassland punctuated by rocky outcroppings and deep ravines that could hide predators or swallow an unwary rider. Robert taught Alexis to ride when she was 4 years old, not as recreation but as a necessary skill for working cattle across terrain where a vehicle couldn't go. By the time she was 8, she could rope a steer, brand a calf, and read the subtle signs that indicated when a 1,000-pound bull was about to charge. More importantly, she had learned to make split-second decisions in situations where the wrong choice could result in serious injury or death. The lesson that shaped everything came when she was 12 years old. During the spring roundup that marked the beginning of each year's cattle season, She was working with her father and 2 ranch hands to gather a herd that had scattered into one of the remote sections of the property, an area known for rattlesnakes and sudden drop-offs that had claimed the lives of several horses over the years. The work was routine until one of the ranch hands, a young man named Tommy Castellanos, who had been hired just a month earlier, made a mistake that nearly cost him his life. Tommy was trying to turn a stubborn steer that had broken away from the group when his horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and went down hard. The horse recovered quickly, but Tommy landed awkwardly and heard something snap in his left leg. The steer, already agitated by the commotion, lowered its head and prepared to charge the fallen rider. Tommy had lost his rope in the fall and was too injured to move quickly. The nearest cover was 50 yards away across broken ground that he couldn't navigate with what was obviously a fractured tibia. Robert was a quarter-mile away, moving another part of the herd, when he heard Tommy shout for help. Alexis was closer, maybe 200 yards, but she was 12 years old and mounted on a horse that was trained for ranch work, not emergency response. In the 15 seconds it took her father to assess the situation and start riding toward the emergency, several things became clear. Tommy was going to be trampled or gored if something didn't happen immediately. The steer was too agitated to be scared off by shouting, and the only person close enough to intervene was a child who weighed 90 pounds and had no experience dealing with a life-threatening emergency. Robert's voice cut across the distance with the kind of calm authority that had once guided Marine snipers through enemy territory. He didn't shout instructions or waste time explaining the situation. Instead, he spoke to Alexis in the same measured tone he used when teaching her to rope or repair fence line. He told her to approach the steer from the left side, staying mounted until the last possible moment. He told her to use her rope to distract the animal, not to try to catch it, just to get its attention away from Tommy. He told her that she had maybe 10 seconds before the situation became irreversible, and that she needed to think clearly rather than react emotionally. Alexis followed her father's instructions with a precision that surprised even her. She approached the steer at an angle that put her between the animal and Tommy, without directly challenging it for territorial dominance. When she was 30 feet away, she began swinging her rope in wide loops over her head, creating movement and sound that drew the steer's attention without triggering an immediate charge response. She kept her horse moving in a pattern that gradually shifted the steer's position, using the animal's natural tendency to face potential threats to maneuver it away from the injured ranch hand. The entire sequence lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time Robert reached the scene, Tommy was safe and the steer had been directed back toward the main herd. Tommy's leg was broken, but not life-threateningly injured, and the helicopter evacuation that followed proceeded without complications. But the real lesson wasn't about cattle management or emergency response. It was about the psychological state of mind that allowed someone to think clearly when everything was falling apart. That evening, as they sat on the ranch house porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Robert explained what had really happened during the emergency. He told Alexis that most people panic in crisis situations because they focus on what might go wrong instead of what needs to be done right. He explained that the key to handling pressure was to break every situation down into manageable components, assess the threat, identify available resources, choose the best option from available alternatives, then execute the plan without second-guessing the decision. More importantly, he taught her that effective action under pressure wasn't about being fearless. It was about acknowledging fear without allowing it to control decision-making. He told her that he'd been terrified watching her approach that steer, not because he doubted her ability to follow instructions, but because he understood that even the best plans could go wrong when dealing with unpredictable variables. The difference between heroes and victims, he explained, wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite it. This lesson became the foundation of how Alexis approached every challenge in her life. When she decided to join the military at 18, it wasn't because she was seeking adventure or trying to escape small town Montana. It was because she recognized that her natural ability to remain calm under pressure was a skill that could serve a larger purpose. When she volunteered for increasingly specialized and dangerous assignments, it wasn't because she enjoyed violence or sought out conflict. It was because she understood that someone had to do the difficult jobs, and she was better equipped than most people to handle them successfully. The psychological principles her father taught her on a Montana cattle ranch became the mental framework that allowed her to survive 8 years of classified operations in places where hesitation meant death and emotional responses were liabilities rather than assets. She learned to compartmentalize fear without becoming reckless, to assess threats without becoming paranoid, and to use controlled violence as a tool for achieving specific objectives rather than an outlet for aggression or anger. When she transitioned to civilian life and eventually to contract work, evaluating military training programs, these same principles helped her maintain the emotional distance necessary to observe dangerous situations without becoming emotionally invested in their outcomes. She could watch young soldiers make mistakes during training exercises without experiencing the protective instincts that might cause her to intervene inappropriately. She could assess safety protocols and training effectiveness from the perspective of someone who understood both the psychology of combat and the importance of allowing people to learn from controlled failures. But there were limits to how much detachment was possible when lives were actually at risk. When training exercises stopped being controlled learning environments and became genuine emergencies, the same psychological framework that had made her an effective operator would compel her to act. The 12-year-old girl who had saved a ranch hand from a charging steer was still present in the 31-year-old contractor observing training exercises at Camp Thornfield. In 30 seconds. When 3 Marine recruits found themselves in a situation that their training hadn't prepared them to handle, that 12-year-old girl was going to remind everyone present why her father had taught her that the most important skill anyone could learn was thinking clearly when everything was falling apart. At 18, Alexis Ramone walked into the Army recruitment office in Billings with a folder containing her high school transcripts, letters of recommendation from 3 teachers, and a handwritten note from her father that simply read, "She's ready." The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Maria Vega, had processed hundreds of applicants from rural Montana, most of them young men looking to escape small towns or young women seeking education benefits. What she saw in Alexis was different: a quiet confidence that suggested someone who had already been tested by circumstances more demanding than high school algebra and Friday night football games. The initial processing went smoothly. Alexis scored 98 on her Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, qualifying her for any military occupational specialty the Army offered. Her physical fitness assessment results placed her in the 95th percentile for her age group, with particularly strong scores in endurance events and upper body strength that surprised evaluators, who had expected ranch work to emphasize leg strength and cardiovascular fitness. More notably, her psychological evaluation revealed stress tolerance levels that were typically seen only in candidates who had already experienced significant trauma or high-pressure situations. Basic training at Fort Moore, Georgia, was designed to break down civilian attitudes and rebuild them according to military standards. For most recruits, this process involved weeks of adjustment to institutional authority, collective responsibility, and physical demands that exceeded anything they had previously experienced. For Alexis, basic training felt like a structured version of lessons her father had been teaching her since childhood. The drill sergeants who tried to intimidate her with Aggressive questioning found themselves facing someone who responded to pressure with calm attention rather than defensive reactions. Her marksmanship scores were exceptional from the beginning. The rifle range instructors noted that she required minimal coaching on breathing techniques, trigger control, or sight alignment skills that typically took weeks to develop. When asked about her previous shooting experience, she mentioned hunting and ranch work, but didn't elaborate on the hours her father had spent teaching her to engage targets at distances that exceeded standard hunting requirements, or the lessons in windage and elevation adjustments that had been disguised as casual conversations about ballistics and physics. More importantly, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of small unit tactics that suggested someone who had been thinking strategically about combat before arriving at basic training. During field exercises, she consistently positioned herself where she could observe the entire tactical situation rather than focusing only on her assigned sector. She anticipated orders before they were given, identified cover and concealment opportunities that other recruits missed, and showed an ability to maintain situational awareness even during high-stress scenarios designed to overwhelm new soldiers. Advanced individual training that followed basic training introduced her to the specialized skills of infantry combat. At Fort Moore's Infantry School, she learned urban warfare techniques, combat marksmanship, and small unit leadership principles that would form the foundation of her military career. Her instructors noted that she absorbed tactical concepts with unusual speed and demonstrated what they described as operational maturity that was rare among soldiers with no combat experience. During a night navigation exercise in her 6th week of 8, Alexis demonstrated the kind of instinctive tactical thinking that would later catch the attention of special operations recruiters. The exercise required students to move through several kilometers of dense forest using only map and compass, reaching designated checkpoints while avoiding instructor teams that were positioned to simulate enemy patrols. Most students approached the exercise as a test of navigation skills, focusing on maintaining accurate headings and calculating distances traveled. Alexis approached it as a combat mission. She studied the terrain features and weather conditions to identify the routes that enemy forces would most likely use for their own movement. She timed her approach to each checkpoint to coincide with weather patterns that would mask the sound of her movement. Most importantly, she recognized that the exercise was designed to teach lessons about operational security that went beyond simple navigation. When she encountered an instructor team that was supposed to represent an enemy patrol, she didn't simply try to avoid detection. She spent 20 minutes conducting surveillance to determine their movement patterns before selecting a route that exploited the blind spots in their coverage. Her final score on the exercise was perfect, but what impressed her instructors was the after-action report she submitted, describing tactical vulnerabilities she had observed in the instructor team's positioning and patrol patterns. The report demonstrated analytical thinking that was typically associated with much more experienced soldiers, and it included recommendations for improving the training value of the exercise that were later incorporated into the curriculum. It was this report that brought her to the attention of Captain James Morrison, a Ranger-qualified infantry officer who served as a talent scout for special operations units. Morrison had been directed to identify soldiers who demonstrated exceptional potential for advanced training programs that prepared personnel for classified missions. He looked for candidates who combined technical proficiency with the kind of mature judgment that allowed them to operate independently in complex environments. Morrison arranged to interview Alexis during her final week of 8, ostensibly to discuss career opportunities in conventional infantry units. The interview lasted 2 hours and covered topics ranging from her Montana ranch background to her thoughts on leadership, philosophy, and decision-making under pressure. Morrison didn't mention special operations or classified programs, But he asked questions that were designed to assess whether she possessed the psychological characteristics necessary for work that involved moral ambiguity and extreme personal risk. Questions that most soldiers found difficult to answer. Alexis addressed with the kind of thoughtful precision that suggested someone who had already worked through the ethical implications of using violence to achieve political objectives. When Morrison described hypothetical scenarios involving civilian casualties or collateral damage, she demonstrated an ability to analyze complex situations without becoming emotionally overwhelmed or morally paralyzed. When he asked about her long-term career goals, she expressed interest in assignments that would allow her to use her skills to make meaningful contributions to national security. 3 weeks after graduation from 8, Alexis received orders that directed her to report to a military installation that didn't appear on any public maps for training, that wasn't described in any official documentation. The orders were signed by a colonel whose name she couldn't find in any military directory, and they included travel instructions that required her to surrender her personal electronics and sign non-disclosure agreements that carried potential prison sentences for violations. The training that followed would transform her from a skilled infantry soldier into something much more dangerous. She would learn techniques that weren't taught in any conventional military school, from instructors whose backgrounds were so classified that she was never told their real names. She would discover that her natural ability to remain calm under pressure and think strategically about violence made her exceptionally well suited for missions that required precision application of lethal force under circumstances where traditional military operations were politically impossible. But before she learned to kill quietly and disappear without trace, before she spent years operating in countries that she was never allowed to discuss, before she became someone whose existence was officially denied, Alexis Ramone was simply an 18-year-old from Montana who had impressed a ranger captain with her ability to think clearly about complicated problems, the same clarity of thought that would later allow her to eliminate high-value targets without hesitation or regret. Would soon help 3 Marine recruits understand the difference between pointing weapons during training exercises and pointing them at someone who had been professionally trained to respond with lethal force. The pattern began during her first classified deployment, when a CIA case officer named Harrison introduced her to a group of Afghan National Army officers as our medical specialist, despite the fact that she carried no medical equipment and had received no medical training beyond basic combat lifesaver certification. The Afghan officers looked at her slight frame, her careful way of speaking, and her deferential behavior around the male operators, and they concluded that she was probably a nurse or perhaps a communications specialist whose presence was required for administrative reasons rather than operational necessity. This assumption nearly got 2 of them killed 3 days later when their convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar, and Alexis eliminated 4 Taliban fighters with precision rifle fire, while the Afghan officers were still trying to locate the source of incoming rounds. The after-action report noted that the Afghan personnel had been surprised by the contractor's tactical proficiency, which was military euphemism for the fact that they had completely misjudged what she was capable of accomplishing. Under combat conditions, the pattern repeated itself. During her second deployment, when a European intelligence officer dismissed her as typical American military support personnel during a briefing about arms trafficking networks in Eastern Europe, he spent 20 minutes explaining regional criminal organizations to her as if she were a secretary taking notes for her supervisors, using simple language and basic concepts that suggested he believed she lacked the background to understand complex criminal enterprises. 2 weeks later, She was sitting across a restaurant table from the leader of one of those criminal organizations, convincing him that she was a corrupt American contractor willing to sell classified weapons technology while simultaneously gathering intelligence that would lead to his arrest and the disruption of his entire network during her final deployment in North Africa. A British SAS liaison officer suggested that she might be more comfortable remaining at the forward operating base while the actual operators conducted the mission to eliminate the terrorist cell leader. He explained that combat operations in urban environments required experience and training that support personnel typically didn't possess, and that her presence might compromise the team's ability to move quickly and quietly through hostile territory. She listened to his concerns politely and agreed to follow whatever protocol he recommended. 18 hours later, when the mission had devolved into a running firefight through refugee camps and the SAS officer was pinned down by sniper fire, she was the one who flanked the enemy position and eliminated 3 combatants with a combination of suppressed pistol fire and improvised explosive devices. The consistent thread through all these experiences was that highly trained military personnel, intelligence officers, and foreign allies made assumptions about her capabilities based on factors that had nothing to do with her actual training or operational experience. They saw a woman who was smaller than most of her male colleagues, who spoke quietly rather than loudly, who asked questions rather than making pronouncements, and who seemed comfortable taking direction rather than assuming leadership roles. From these observations, they concluded that she must be someone whose job involved support functions rather than direct action missions, even within her own unit, where her background and training were known to her immediate supervisors. There were constant reminders that her colleagues viewed her as an anomaly rather than a standard operator. During mission briefings, new team members would often assume that she was responsible for communications or intelligence analysis rather than direct action objectives. When gear was distributed for missions, quartermasters would sometimes attempt to issue her equipment designed for support personnel, rather than the specialized weapons and tools required for close-quarters combat and assassination work. The assumptions weren't always based on gender, though that was certainly a factor. Part of the problem was that she didn't look like what people expected special operations personnel to look like. She wasn't tall or obviously muscular. She didn't carry herself with the aggressive confidence that characterized many operators who had come from conventional special forces backgrounds. She didn't use the profanity-laden vocabulary or adopt the casual disregard for authority that was common among personnel who had spent years in units where traditional military hierarchy was less important than operational effectiveness. Instead, she maintained the polite professionalism that she had learned from her father and refined during her conventional military training. She addressed superiors and colleagues with the kind of respectful formality that suggested someone who understood military protocol and took it seriously. She asked for clarification when she didn't understand something rather than pretending to comprehend concepts that were beyond her experience. She listened more than she spoke during briefings and planning sessions, contributing only when she had specific information or insights that were relevant to the discussion. This behavioral pattern served her well operationally because it allowed her to blend into civilian environments where aggressive military bearing would have compromised her cover identity. But it also reinforced the perception among military personnel that she was someone who had been assigned to their unit for administrative reasons rather than operational capability. Even after successful missions where her performance exceeded that of more conventionally aggressive teammates, colleagues would sometimes express surprise that someone like her had been able to accomplish complex tactical objectives. The psychological impact of constantly being underestimated was complex and cumulative. On one hand, It provided significant operational advantages because enemies and potential threats consistently failed to recognize her as someone who posed a danger to their security. Criminal organizations, terrorist cells, and foreign intelligence services made the same assumptions as her own colleagues, allowing her to operate in environments where a more obviously threatening presence would have attracted immediate attention and suspicion. On the other hand, the constant need to prove herself to people who should have known better created a psychological tension that became increasingly difficult to manage as her career progressed. She found herself taking unnecessary risks during missions, not because operational requirements demanded them, but because she needed to demonstrate to her colleagues that their assumptions about her capabilities were incorrect. She volunteered for assignments that were more dangerous than necessary, accepted mission parameters that placed her at greater risk than was tactically sound, and pushed herself to performance standards that exceeded what was required for mission success. More problematically, she began to internalize some of the doubt that others expressed about her suitability for special operations work. During post-mission psychological evaluations, she would sometimes question whether her tactical decisions had been influenced by a desire to prove herself, rather than by objective analysis of operational requirements. She wondered whether her colleagues' assumptions about her limitations might be based on accurate assessments of weaknesses that she was unable to recognize in herself. The pattern of underestimation followed her into civilian life when she transitioned to contract work evaluating military training programs. Despite her extensive background and the fact that her evaluation reports consistently identified real problems and provided actionable recommendations, military personnel at the installations she visited routinely treated her as if she were an inexperienced bureaucrat whose job was to complete paperwork rather than conduct meaningful assessments. Training instructors would explain basic military concepts to her as if she had never served in uniform. Safety officers would walk her through simple protocols as if she had never been exposed to weapons or dangerous equipment. Base commanders would schedule courtesy meetings to orient her to military culture and procedures, apparently unaware that she had spent 8 years operating in environments where cultural misunderstandings could result in mission failure or loss of life. At Camp Thornfield, the pattern had been consistent with her previous experiences. Staff Sergeant Torino treated her with professional courtesy but clearly viewed her as someone whose primary qualification was familiarity with Pentagon bureaucracy rather than practical understanding of military training requirements. The other instructors were polite but dismissive, answering her questions with the kind of simplified explanations that suggested they believed she lacked the technical background to understand complex training concepts. The recruits barely acknowledged her presence, which was appropriate given her role as an observer, but also reflected their assumption that civilian contractors were irrelevant to their military development. When they noticed her at all, they saw someone who looked like she worked in an office building rather than someone who had spent years in environments where office buildings were targets rather than workplaces. In 60 seconds, when a training exercise became an emergency that threatened the lives of 3 young Marines, every person at Camp Thornfield would learn why it was dangerous to make assumptions about quiet women who carried clipboards and took notes during military training exercises. The invitation to observe the advanced combat training exercises at Camp Thornfield had arrived through official channels, accompanied by the kind of bureaucratic language that made it sound like a routine administrative requirement, rather than a response to growing concerns about training effectiveness. The Pentagon's Special Operations Command had been receiving reports from field commanders indicating that recent graduates from infantry training programs were struggling with decision-making under pressure, particularly in scenarios that deviated from scripted training protocols. Too many young soldiers were freezing during their first real combat encounters, hesitating when immediate action was required, or making tactical errors that suggested fundamental gaps in their preparation. The problem wasn't with basic military skills. Recruits were graduating with excellent marksmanship scores, solid physical fitness levels, and thorough knowledge of weapon systems and battlefield procedures. The issue is psychological preparation for the kind of chaotic, unpredictable situations where textbook solutions didn't apply and split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Field commanders wanted to know whether current training methods were actually preparing soldiers for the mental demands of combat, or simply teaching them to follow predetermined scripts that would prove inadequate under real-world conditions. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, who oversaw training evaluation programs for the Special Operations Command, had specifically requested that Alexis conduct the assessment at Camp Thornfield because of her unique perspective on both effective training methods and actual combat requirements. Unlike civilian contractors who specialized in administrative evaluation or former military personnel, whose experience was limited to conventional operations, Alexis understood what soldiers needed to survive in situations where established procedures broke down and improvisation became the difference between life and death. Her initial observations during the first 3 weeks at Camp Thornfield had been generally positive. The facility was well maintained, the equipment was modern and properly serviced, and the instructors demonstrated solid technical knowledge of infantry tactics and weapon systems. Staff Sergeant Torino ran discipline training sessions that covered all required subjects according to established curricula, and his safety protocols were comprehensive and strictly enforced. The recruits showed appropriate respect for their instructors and seemed motivated to learn the skills they were being taught. But Alexis had also identified several areas of concern that weren't immediately apparent to casual observers. The training scenarios were highly structured, with predetermined outcomes that allowed little room for creative problem-solving or adaptive thinking. Recruits were taught to respond to specific situations with specific procedures, but they received limited experience in analyzing novel problems or developing solutions when standard protocols weren't applicable. More troubling, the training emphasized compliance with instructions over independent judgment, creating soldiers who could execute orders efficiently but might struggle when circumstances required them to think beyond their training. The most significant concern was that the training environment was too predictable and controlled to prepare soldiers for the psychological stress of actual combat. The scenarios were designed to test technical skills rather than mental resilience, and the safety protocols that were necessary for training purposes also eliminated the kind of genuine uncertainty and risk that characterized real military operations. Recruits learned to perform under simulated pressure, but they weren't being prepared for situations where simulation became reality and mistakes carried real consequences. Staff Sergeant Torino embodied both the strengths and limitations of the training program he supervised. He was a competent infantry NCO with solid field experience and genuine concern for the soldiers under his command. His technical knowledge was extensive, his leadership style was firm but fair, and his commitment to safety was absolute. But he had spent his entire career in conventional military units where established procedures and clear chains of command provided structure for most operational situations. He had never been required to operate in environments where official doctrine was inadequate, and personal initiative was more important than compliance with regulations. This background shaped his approach to training in ways that were both beneficial and problematic. He taught recruits to follow procedures precisely and to maintain discipline under pressure, skills that were essential for effective military operations. But he also inadvertently taught them to look for external guidance when faced with unfamiliar situations, to wait for orders rather than taking initiative, and to prioritize rule following over problem solving. When the two came into conflict, the dynamic between Torino and his recruits reflected broader issues within military training culture that prioritized institutional control over individual development. Recruits learned that success was measured by their ability to meet predetermined standards, rather than their capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. They were rewarded for conformity and compliance, while creativity and independent thinking were subtly discouraged through training methods that emphasized repetition and standardization over analysis and innovation. Private Kowalski exemplified the type of soldier this system produced: physically capable, technically proficient, and eager to prove himself, but lacking the kind of mature judgment that would allow him to function effectively when faced with situations that weren't covered in training manuals. His aggressive confidence was based on success in controlled training environments where the parameters were clearly defined and the outcomes were largely predictable. He had never been tested by genuine uncertainty or forced to make decisions when the consequences of failure extended beyond receiving corrected feedback from instructors. Private Santos represented a different type of challenge, a soldier whose hypervigilance and quick reflexes were assets in many situations but could become liabilities when they led to overreaction or premature escalation. His background had taught him to respond quickly to potential threats, but military training hadn't provided him with the kind of nuanced threat assessment skills that would allow him to distinguish between situations that required immediate action and those that called for patience and careful observation. Private Fletcher posed the most complex training challenge because his natural tendency toward caution and methodical analysis could be either a strength or a weakness, depending on the circumstances. In situations that required careful planning and precise execution, his deliberate approach would serve him well. But in scenarios that demanded immediate action without complete information, his hesitation could prove dangerous, not only to himself but to other soldiers who were counting on him for support. The training scenario that was about to unfold would test all three recruits in ways that their previous experience hadn't prepared them to handle. More importantly, it would reveal whether current training methods were actually preparing young soldiers for the psychological demands of situations where training became inadequate and survival depended on their ability to think clearly under extreme pressure. Alexis had been observing these dynamics for 3 weeks, taking notes on training effectiveness and safety protocols, while mentally cataloging the gaps between what soldiers were being taught and what they would need to survive in actual combat operations. Her evaluation report was nearly complete, with recommendations for improving scenario design and incorporating more realistic stress factors into training protocols. She had not expected to become directly involved in demonstrating why those improvements were necessary. In 30 seconds, when a routine training exercise became a genuine emergency, she would transition from passive observer to active participant, using skills that officially didn't exist to save soldiers whose training had left them unprepared for situations where textbook solutions proved inadequate. The quiet contractor, taking notes, was about to provide a practical demonstration of why military training needed to prepare soldiers not just for following orders, but for thinking clearly when orders weren't available and improvisation became a matter of life and death. The morning of September 15th began with the same routine that had characterized every training day during Alexis's 3 weeks at Camp Thornfield. The recruits assembled at 0630 hours for physical training. followed by equipment inspection and a briefing on the day's exercises. Staff Sergeant Torino outlined a series of close-quarters combat scenarios designed to test the recruits' ability to clear buildings, engage multiple targets, and coordinate their movements in confined spaces. The scenarios were progressively more complex, beginning with single-room clearances and building toward multi-room structures with concealed role players and simulated casualties. Alexis positioned herself in her usual observation spot near the training complex, a cluster of plywood and concrete structures designed to replicate urban combat environments. She carried her standard equipment, tablet, clipboard, digital camera for documenting safety protocols, and settled into the routine of watching, taking notes, and evaluating training effectiveness. The morning exercises proceeded normally, with recruits demonstrating competent technical skills while making the kind of minor tactical errors that were typical for soldiers at their experience level. The first indication that something was different came during the lunch break, when Staff Sergeant Torino received a radio call that lasted longer than usual and involved several references to personnel changes and modified scenarios. Alexis noted the conversation, but didn't think much of it. Training schedules were frequently adjusted to accommodate equipment availability, instructor assignments, and other administrative factors. When Torino announced that the afternoon exercise would involve a slightly different scenario than originally planned, it seemed like a routine modification, rather than a significant change in training protocol. Modified scenario was described as an enhanced realism exercise that would test the recruits' ability to handle unexpected developments during building clearance operations. Instead of following predetermined scripts, the role players would improvise their responses based on the recruits' actions, creating a more dynamic training environment that better replicated the unpredictability of actual combat operations. The safety protocols remained the same. All weapons were loaded with blank ammunition, protective equipment was mandatory, and instructors would maintain visual contact with all participants throughout the exercise. What Torino didn't know was that one of the regular role players had called in sick that morning, and his replacement was Corporal Bradley Davis, a 19-year-old military police soldier who had been transferred to Camp Thornfield just 2 days earlier. Davis had extensive experience with law enforcement scenarios, but limited background in infantry combat training. More importantly, he hadn't participated in the detailed briefings that prepared regular role players for the psychological aspects of creating realistic training stress without crossing the line into actual danger. Davis was enthusiastic about his new assignment and eager to prove that he could contribute effectively to the training program. When he was briefed on his role as an insurgent fighter who would provide resistance during the building clearance exercise, he interpreted the instructions to make it realistic as a directive to be as aggressive and unpredictable as possible. He understood that he was supposed to challenge the recruits and force them to make difficult tactical decisions, but he didn't fully comprehend the carefully calibrated balance between training stress and genuine psychological pressure that experienced role players maintained. The exercise began at 1,400 hours with the 3 recruits Kowalski, Santos, and Fletcher receiving their mission briefing from Staff Sergeant Torino. They were told that the target building contained an unknown number of hostile fighters and possibly civilians, and that their objective was to clear the structure, room by room, while minimizing casualties and gathering intelligence about enemy activities. The scenario was designed to last approximately 30 minutes, with multiple decision points that would test their tactical judgment and ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Alexis observed the initial phases of the exercise from her position 50 meters from the target building. The recruits demonstrated solid basic skills as they approached the structure, with appropriate attention to cover and concealment, effective communication, and coordinated movement that reflected their training. They established security around the building perimeter, identified potential entry points, and developed a plan for systematic clearance that followed established infantry doctrine. The problems began when they encountered their first role player, Corporal Davis, who was positioned in a second-floor room with instructions to simulate a sniper attempting to delay the clearing operation. Davis had been told to engage the recruits with blank fire and then withdraw to a predetermined position, creating the kind of running firefight that would force them to make tactical decisions under pressure. But instead of following the scripted sequence, Davis decided to escalate the scenario by moving to intercept the recruits in the main hallway, creating an unexpected close-quarters encounter that wasn't part of the planned exercise. The confrontation occurred in a narrow corridor where the recruits had limited maneuvering space and no clear routes for withdrawal. Davis appeared suddenly from a doorway they had already cleared, carrying what appeared to be an AK-47 rifle and shouting commands in a language none of them recognized. The recruits were supposed to be prepared for unexpected contact, but the combination of confined space, surprise appearance, and Davis's aggressive behavior created a level of stress that exceeded their training experience. Private Kowalski reacted first, bringing his rifle up and shouting for Davis to drop his weapon. But instead of following the training protocol that would have de-escalated the situation, Davis stepped closer and raised his own weapon in response. Private Santos attempted to flank the role player, but tripped over equipment that hadn't been properly staged for the exercise, going down hard and losing control of his rifle. Private Fletcher found himself caught between his two teammates, with no clear field of fire and no room to maneuver. Staff Sergeant Torino was monitoring the exercise from a position outside the building, using radio communications to coordinate with other instructors and track the recruits' progress through the structure. He could hear the escalating verbal exchange, but couldn't see what was happening in the hallway. His radio calls to Davis requesting status updates went unanswered because Davis was focused on maintaining his role as an enemy fighter and wasn't monitoring his communication equipment. From her observation position, Alexis could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The recruits were showing signs of genuine stress rather than training pressure. Rapid breathing, tunnel vision, and the kind of muscle tension that indicated fight-or-flight responses were overriding their tactical training. More concerning, Davis appeared to be feeding off their anxiety, escalating his own aggressive behavior in response to their obvious discomfort. The critical moment came when Davis made a decision that transformed the training exercise into something potentially dangerous. Instead of following any recognizable training protocol, he grabbed Private Santos by his equipment harness and began dragging him toward a doorway while maintaining his grip on the training rifle. Santos was still disoriented from his fall and couldn't offer effective resistance. Kowalski and Fletcher were frozen by uncertainty. Their training hadn't prepared them for a situation where a role player was using physical force against another recruit, and they weren't sure whether this was part of the exercise or a genuine emergency. That's when Davis noticed Alexis. She was standing near the edge of the training area, close enough to observe the exercise but clearly identified as a civilian contractor by her clothing and equipment. Davis looked at her through the window of the building and made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing the scripted exercise with the recruits, he decided to incorporate the civilian observer into the scenario, apparently believing that this would make the training more realistic and challenging for the soldiers. Davis released Santos and moved quickly toward the building entrance, still carrying the training rifle and maintaining his aggressive role-playing demeanor. When he emerged from the building, he pointed the weapon directly at Alexis and began shouting that she was now his hostage, that the recruits would have to negotiate for her release, and that any attempt to intervene would result in her death. The recruits stared in shocked confusion. Staff Sergeant Torino's voice crackled over the radio, demanding to know what was happening. Other instructors began moving toward the scene, but were too far away to intervene immediately. Davis continued advancing toward Alexis. The training rifle now held inches from her face, his eyes bright with the adrenaline of what he believed was innovative role-playing that would provide the recruits with an unforgettable training experience. He had no idea that the quiet civilian contractor he was threatening had spent 8 years learning how to kill people exactly like him under circumstances exactly like this. In 12 seconds, Corporal Davis would discover why pointing weapons at certain people, even training weapons during exercises, was a decision that carried consequences he hadn't considered. The recruits were about to receive the most valuable lesson of their military careers, taught by someone whose qualifications for instruction had never appeared on any official training curriculum. The training rifle that Corporal Davis thrust toward Alexis's face was an exact replica of an AK-47, complete with authentic weight, balance, and mechanical function. The only difference between this weapon and the one she had faced in actual combat operations was the bright orange tip that identified it as a training device and the blank ammunition that posed no lethal threat beyond extremely close range. But Davis was holding it 6 inches from her eyes, close enough that the psychological impact was identical to facing a loaded weapon held by someone with hostile intent. Alexis's first response was purely physiological, an instant flood of stress hormones that sharpened her vision, accelerated her heart rate, and triggered the kind of hyper-awareness that had kept her alive during 8 years of classified operations. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, but every muscle in her body was suddenly primed for explosive action. The careful psychological compartmentalization that had allowed her to function as a civilian contractor for the past 2 years dissolved in milliseconds, replaced by combat instincts that had been honed through countless hours of training and refined through real-world application under lethal circumstances. Her voice, when she spoke, carried none of the measured professionalism that had characterized her interactions with Camp Thornfield personnel for 3 weeks. Instead, it held the kind of calm authority that she had once used to coordinate tactical operations in environments where hesitation meant mission failure and death. She told Davis that he was making a serious mistake and that he needed to lower his weapon immediately. Her tone suggested someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question, even when the person receiving orders outranked her or possessed apparent advantages in size or armament. Davis, still caught up in what he believed was innovative role-playing, interpreted her calm response as evidence that his scenario was working effectively. He had expected the civilian contractor to show fear or panic, and her steady demeanor convinced him that she was either extremely brave or didn't fully understand the danger she was supposed to be facing. He decided to escalate his performance, stepping closer and pressing the barrel of the training rifle against her forehead while shouting demands that the recruits surrender their weapons or watch their observer die. The recruits were experiencing what psychologists call cognitive overload, a state where incoming information exceeds the brain's ability to process it effectively, resulting in delayed reactions and poor decision-making. They had been trained to handle hostile encounters with enemy fighters, but they had never been prepared for situations involving threats to civilian personnel, particularly someone who was supposed to be under their protection. Private Kowalski's finger moved toward his trigger, but he hesitated because he wasn't certain whether shooting a role player, even one who appeared to be threatening a contractor, was an appropriate response during a training exercise. Private Santos had regained his footing and retrieved his rifle, but he was positioned at an angle where any shot he attempted would risk hitting Alexis if Davis moved unexpectedly. Private Fletcher was calculating distances and angles, trying to determine whether he could physically intervene without escalating the situation further. All 3 recruits were operating under the assumption that this was still part of the training scenario and that there must be some predetermined solution they were supposed to identify and implement. Staff Sergeant Torino was running toward the scene from his observation position, shouting commands that nobody was processing clearly. Other instructors were converging from various locations around the training complex, but they were still 30 seconds away from reaching a position where they could effectively intervene. The radio chatter was becoming increasingly frantic as personnel tried to understand whether this was an authorized modification to the exercise or a genuine emergency requiring immediate response. What none of them understood was that Alexis had already conducted the tactical assessment that would determine how the next 10 seconds unfolded. She had evaluated Davis's position, identified his most likely reactions to various stimuli, calculated the time required to disarm him, and determined that the optimal window for action was rapidly approaching. More importantly, she had recognized that Davis's escalating behavior suggested someone who was no longer thinking clearly about the consequences of his actions, making him genuinely unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Despite the fact that his weapon was loaded with blank ammunition, the decision to act wasn't based on fear or anger emotions that would have compromised her tactical effectiveness, but on a clinical assessment that the situation had progressed beyond the point where passive compliance was likely to result in a successful outcome. Davis was showing signs of what she recognized as adrenaline-induced tunnel vision, a psychological state where people became fixated on immediate objectives while losing awareness of broader consequences. In her experience, individuals in this state were prone to making increasingly poor decisions that could escalate minor incidents into major crises. Her movement began with a controlled exhalation that helped maintain the kind of precise muscle coordination that was essential for close-quarters disarmament techniques. Her left hand came up in a smooth arc that intercepted the rifle barrel before Davis could react, using a technique that redirected the weapon's muzzle away from her head while simultaneously establishing control over its movement. The motion was so fluid and natural that observers later described it as looking almost casual, as if she were simply reaching up to adjust her hair. The grip break that followed was executed with the kind of mechanical precision that resulted from thousands of hours of repetitive training. Her right hand drove into Davis's wrist at the exact angle required to disrupt his grip on the weapon, while her left hand maintained control of the barrel, ensuring that even if he managed to pull the trigger, the muzzle would be pointed safely away from any personnel. The technique was designed to work against opponents who were larger and stronger, using leverage and joint manipulation rather than brute force to achieve weapon control. Davis's attempt to retain control of the rifle actually worked against him, as his resistance provided the momentum that Alexis used to complete the disarmament sequence. His forward pressure allowed her to pull him off balance while simultaneously twisting the weapon from his grasp. The sweep that took his legs out from under him was timed to coincide with his maximum extension, when his center of gravity was furthest from his base of support and he had no opportunity to recover his balance. Entire sequence from initial hand movement to Davis hitting the ground lasted exactly 4 seconds. By the time the recruits had processed what they were seeing, Alexis was standing over an unconscious role player with the training rifle pointed safely at the ground. Davis wasn't seriously injured, but the impact with the concrete had knocked him unconscious and would result in a concussion that would keep him in the base medical facility for observation overnight. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of running footsteps as Staff Sergeant Torino and the other instructors reached the scene. The recruits stood frozen, their weapons still raised but no longer tracking any target. their expressions reflecting the kind of cognitive dissonance that results from witnessing events that contradict fundamental assumptions about how the world operates. Private Kowalski was the first to speak, asking in a voice that reflected genuine confusion whether what had just happened was part of the training exercise. Private Santos lowered his rifle and stared at Alexis as if he were seeing her for the first time. Private Fletcher looked back and forth between the unconscious Davis and the quiet contractor who had just disarmed him with techniques that weren't taught in any conventional military training. Program Staff Sergeant Torino reached them and immediately began checking Davis for injuries while simultaneously demanding an explanation of what had occurred. Other instructors were establishing a security perimeter and calling for medical assistance. Following protocols designed for genuine emergencies rather than training scenarios, Alexis handed the training rifle to Private Fletcher and knelt beside Davis to assess his condition. Using medical training that she had never mentioned in any conversation with Camp Thornfield personnel, her evaluation was quick but thorough, checking for signs of serious head injury while monitoring his breathing and pulse rate. When Davis regained consciousness 30 seconds later, she helped him into a sitting position and conducted a basic neurological assessment to determine whether he required immediate evacuation to a civilian medical facility. The quiet contractor, who had spent 3 weeks taking notes on training procedures, had just provided the recruits with a practical demonstration of skills that weren't included in any official military curriculum. More importantly, she had shown them what effective response under pressure actually looked like when textbook solutions weren't available and improvisation became a matter of survival. In 2 minutes, when the immediate medical emergency was resolved and the training area was secured, everyone at Camp Thornfield would begin asking questions about who Alexis Ramone really was and why a civilian contractor possessed the kind of tactical expertise that allowed her to disarm armed personnel with techniques that most special operations soldiers had never seen. The medical evaluation that followed confirmed that Corporal Davis had sustained a mild concussion but no serious injuries requiring immediate hospitalization. As the base medics loaded him onto a stretcher for transport to the medical facility, Staff Sergeant Torino found himself facing a situation that his 14 years of military experience had not prepared him to handle. The civilian contractor he had dismissed as a harmless bureaucrat had just demonstrated combat skills that exceeded anything he had seen from special operations personnel, and he needed to understand what had actually happened before filing the incident report that would inevitably attract attention from higher command levels. The 3 recruits were experiencing what psychologists call paradigm shift, the disorienting process of having fundamental assumptions proven completely wrong by undeniable evidence. For 3 weeks they had observed Alexis taking notes during their training exercises, seeing her as part of the administrative background that surrounded military life without contributing anything meaningful to their tactical development. The idea that this quiet woman in civilian clothes possessed lethal skills that exceeded their own had never occurred to them. And processing this new information required them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about combat capability and military expertise. Private Kowalski was struggling with cognitive dissonance that went beyond professional embarrassment. He had spent months cultivating an identity based on being tougher and more aggressive than his peers, and the casual efficiency with which Alexis had resolved a situation that had left him frozen challenged his entire conception of what strength and competence looked like. The fact that someone who looked like his older sister could disarm an armed opponent in 4 seconds while he had stood paralyzed by uncertainty forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about whether his swagger and attitude were actually indicators of tactical competence or simply compensation. For insecurity and inexperience, private, Santos was experiencing a different kind of realization. His hypervigilant scanning and constant assessment of potential threats had completely failed to identify the most dangerous person in the area, despite the fact that she had been present and observable for 3 weeks. This failure of situational awareness revealed fundamental gaps in his understanding of how to evaluate human threats and assess operational environments. He was beginning to understand that real tactical awareness required more sophisticated analysis than simply watching for obvious signs of aggression or conventional military bearing. Private Fletcher was having the most complex reaction because his natural tendency toward careful observation meant that he had actually noticed details about Alexis that his teammates had missed. He had observed that she positioned herself where she could see everything that was happening during training exercises, that her questions about procedures demonstrated deeper understanding than casual curiosity would explain, and that she moved with the kind of unconscious confidence that suggested extensive physical training. But he had interpreted these observations as signs that she was a particularly thorough contractor rather than someone with operational background, and he was now questioning his ability to draw accurate conclusions from incomplete information. Staff Sergeant Torino's initial reaction was defensive anger. He had been responsible for maintaining safety and discipline during the training exercise, and the fact that a situation had developed where a civilian contractor was forced to use physical force to protect herself reflected poorly on his leadership and supervision. But as he observed Alexis conducting her medical assessment of Davis and providing clear, professional instructions to the medics, he began to recognize that her responses weren't those of someone who had been lucky or desperate, but someone who had been trained to handle exactly these kinds of situations. The techniques she had used to disarm Davis weren't improvised self-defense moves learned from civilian martial arts classes. They were precise, economical applications of force that suggested extensive training in military close-quarters combat systems. More telling was the calm, methodical way she had transitioned from disarmament to medical assessment, demonstrating the kind of integrated skill set that was typically associated with special operations personnel who had been trained to handle multiple types of emergencies without external support. When Torino asked Alexis to explain what had happened, her response was delivered in the same measured tone she had used during 3 weeks of routine conversations. But the content revealed knowledge and experience that transformed his understanding of who he was dealing with. She explained that Davis had exhibited signs of sympathetic nervous system arousal that indicated he was no longer thinking clearly about the consequences of his actions, that his escalating behavior suggested someone who had lost awareness of the difference between training scenarios and genuine tactical situations, and that intervention had become necessary when passive compliance was no longer likely to prevent the situation from deteriorating further. Her description of the disarmament sequence was delivered in technical language that demonstrated familiarity with military combat systems and tactical doctrine. She explained that she had used a standard weapon retention technique designed to work against larger opponents, that the leverage-based approach minimized the risk of injury to the person being disarmed while ensuring rapid weapon control, and that the follow-up medical assessment was necessary to rule out serious injuries that might not be immediately apparent after head impact with concrete surfaces. What struck Torino most forcefully was that Alexis discussed the incident as if physical confrontation and tactical decision-making were routine aspects of her professional experience rather than extraordinary events that required special explanation. She demonstrated the kind of casual competence that characterized personnel who had handled similar situations many times before, and her clinical analysis of Davis's behavior suggested someone who understood the psychology of violence from both theoretical and practical perspectives. When Torino asked about her background, Alexis provided information that she had been authorized to share with military personnel if circumstances required it. She explained that she was a former infantry soldier with specialized training in close-quarters combat and tactical medicine, that her current contractor position involved evaluating training effectiveness based on her understanding of both institutional requirements and operational realities, and that her intervention had been necessary to prevent a training accident that could have resulted in serious injuries or, worse. She didn't mention her 8 years with units that officially didn't exist, the classified operations in countries she was never allowed to discuss, or the fact that her psychological profile indicated someone who had been trained to kill without hesitation or regret. But she provided enough information to explain why a civilian contractor had been able to handle an armed confrontation with techniques that exceeded what most conventional military personnel would have been capable of implementing. The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and covered topics that Torino had never expected to discuss with someone he had assumed was a Pentagon bureaucrat. Alexis explained the tactical and psychological factors that had contributed to the breakdown of the training exercise, identified specific improvements that could prevent similar incidents in the future, and provided recommendations for modifying training protocols to better prepare soldiers for situations where predetermined scripts proved inadequate. More importantly, she offered to work with Torino and his instructors to develop training scenarios that would expose recruits to the kind of genuine stress and uncertainty that characterized actual combat operations. She explained that current training methods, while safe and administratively convenient, were not adequately preparing soldiers for the psychological demands they would face in environments where hesitation could be fatal and improvisation was often more important than following established procedures. By the time the base medical team had completed their assessment of Davis and transported him to the medical facility, Staff Sergeant Torino had begun to understand that the past 3 weeks of routine observation had actually been a comprehensive evaluation conducted by someone whose qualifications for assessing combat training were based on extensive personal experience with the kind of operations that training was supposed to prepare soldiers to survive. The 3 recruits, meanwhile, were beginning to comprehend that they had just witnessed a demonstration of the skills they needed to develop if they wanted to be effective soldiers, rather than simply graduates of military training programs. The quiet contractor who had seemed irrelevant to their tactical development had just shown them what competence under pressure actually looked like, and they were eager to learn everything she was willing to teach them. The formal after-action review that took place 3 hours after the incident was unlike any training debrief that had ever been conducted at Camp Thornfield. Colonel Marcus Hendricks, the base commander, had driven down from his office after receiving a preliminary report that described a training accident involving contractor intervention and recruit safety concerns. What he found when he arrived was Staff Sergeant Torino recommending that the contractor be invited to participate in redesigning the facility's entire advanced training curriculum. 3 recruits requesting permission to extend their training cycle to work with someone they now referred to as the real instructor, and a medical report indicating that Corporal Davis would require 2 weeks of recovery time before returning to duty. The meeting took place in the base conference room, with Colonel Hendricks, Staff Sergeant Torino, the 3 recruits, and Alexis seated around a table covered with incident reports, medical evaluations, and training documentation. The atmosphere was formal, but charged with the kind of tension that develops when established hierarchies are suddenly called into question by unexpected events. Hendricks had read Alexis's contractor file before the meeting, But the sanitized military record, it contained infantry service with deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, honorable discharge, current work with Pentagon. Training evaluation programs provided no explanation for the tactical proficiency she had demonstrated during the incident. Private Kowalski was the first to speak when Hendricks asked for the recruit's perspective on what had occurred. His account of the disarmament sequence was delivered with a combination of professional respect and personal embarrassment that reflected his growing understanding of how much he didn't know about actual combat skills. He described watching Alexis move with a precision and confidence that made it clear she had performed similar actions many times before, and he admitted that his own response had been inadequate for someone who expected to serve in combat roles where split-second decisions could determine mission success or failure. Private Santos focused his comments on the tactical lessons he had learned from observing the incident. He explained that Alexis had demonstrated threat assessment and response techniques that weren't covered in their current training curriculum, and that her ability to transition seamlessly from disarmament to medical care suggested integrated skill sets that exceeded anything they had been taught to expect from support personnel. He requested permission to work with her to develop better understanding of how to evaluate human threats and respond effectively when standard procedures proved inadequate. Private Fletcher provided the most analytical assessment, describing how the incident had revealed fundamental gaps in his understanding of operational awareness and tactical decision-making. He noted that Alexis had been conducting continuous threat assessment throughout her 3 weeks at the facility, positioning herself where she could observe all training activities while maintaining awareness of potential safety concerns that had escaped the attention of official safety officers. He explained that her intervention had been based on professional evaluation of escalating risk factors, rather than emotional response to personal threat, and he requested guidance on developing similar analytical capabilities. Staff Sergeant Torino's report was more complex, as it needed to address both the administrative aspects of a training accident and the broader implications of discovering that a civilian contractor possessed tactical expertise that exceeded his own. He explained that the incident had been caused by inadequate briefing of replacement personnel and insufficient supervision during modified training scenarios. But he also acknowledged that Alexis's intervention had prevented what could have become a serious safety incident with potential legal and political consequences for the facility. More significantly, Torino recommended that Alexis be invited to collaborate with the instructional staff to develop training modifications that would better prepare recruits for the psychological demands of actual combat operations. He explained that her analysis of current training limitations was based on understanding of both institutional requirements and operational realities that few people possessed, and that her recommendations for improvement were more comprehensive and practical than anything proposed by previous evaluation teams. Colonel Hendricks listened to these reports with growing interest and concern. The administrative aspects of the incident were straightforward. Davis had exceeded his authority as a role player. Safety protocols had been inadequately enforced, and modifications to training scenarios would be necessary to prevent similar occurrences. But the broader implications were more complicated. If a contractor with an apparently conventional military background possessed tactical skills that exceeded those of his instructors and recruits, it suggested either that her official record was incomplete or that current training programs were failing to prepare personnel for operational requirements. When Hendricks asked Alexis to explain her background and qualifications, she provided information that had been cleared for disclosure to senior military personnel but was significantly more detailed than what appeared in her contractor documentation. She explained that her infantry service had included assignment to specialized units that conducted training in advanced combat techniques, that her current evaluation work was based on understanding of both conventional military requirements and special operations applications, and that her intervention during the incident had been necessary to prevent escalation that could have resulted in serious injuries. She didn't provide specifics about classified operations or mention units that officially didn't exist, but she offered enough information to explain why her tactical capabilities exceeded what conventional infantry training would typically produce. More importantly, she outlined specific recommendations for improving the facility's training programs based on her assessment of current limitations and her understanding of what soldiers needed to survive in operational environments. Where textbook solutions proved inadequate, the recommendations she presented were comprehensive and practical, covering everything from scenario design and stress inoculation to instructor training and safety protocol modifications. She explained how current training methods could be modified to provide recruits with experience in genuine decision-making under pressure, how safety protocols could be maintained while introducing realistic uncertainty and risk factors, and how instructional techniques could be improved to develop adaptive thinking rather than simply procedural compliance. Colonel Hendricks recognized that the incident had created an opportunity to address training deficiencies that had been identified in field reports from multiple combat units. Recent graduates were arriving at operational assignments with solid technical skills but inadequate preparation for the psychological demands of actual combat operations. If Alexis could help develop training methods that better prepared soldiers for operational realities, her contribution could have implications that extended far beyond Camp Thornfield. The meeting concluded with Hendricks authorizing a 6-month extension of Alexis's contractor assignment, during which she would work with the instructional staff to develop and implement improved training protocols. The 3 recruits were granted permission to participate in the modified training program, which would serve as a pilot project for potential implementation at other facilities. Staff Sergeant Torino was designated as the primary liaison for curriculum development, with authority to modify existing training schedules and safety protocols as necessary to accommodate the new approaches. 2 weeks later, when Corporal Davis returned from medical leave, he found that the training facility had been transformed into something that resembled the kind of advanced combat training centers used by special operations units rather than conventional infantry schools. The scenarios were more complex and unpredictable. The psychological pressure was significantly higher, and the instructors demonstrated tactical competencies that hadn't been present during his previous assignment to the facility. The quiet contractor who had once seemed irrelevant to military training had become the center of an educational revolution that would eventually influence training programs throughout the military. The recruits who had witnessed her demonstration of tactical competence under pressure were developing into soldiers who could think clearly and act decisively when faced with situations that exceeded their previous training experience. 6 months later, when field commanders began reporting that recent graduates from Camp Thornfield's modified training program were performing significantly better during actual combat operations, Alexis received a personal commendation from the Secretary of Defense and offers to develop similar programs at special operations training facilities across the country. The woman who had once been trained to kill without hesitation or regret had found a new purpose in teaching young soldiers how to survive situations where their lives depended on thinking clearly when everything was falling apart. It wasn't the career she had planned when she left the military, but it was exactly the work she was uniquely qualified to perform. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.